Hello, my name is Ryan Corpo, and I'm the co-coordinator of Pax Christi New York State and a member of the 50th Anniversary Planning Committee alongside my colleague, former National Council Chair and Ambassador of Peace, Isaac Chandler. We are joined by Jim and Shelley Douglas, co-recipients of the 1994 Teacher of Peace Award. In 1977, the Douglases co-founded the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action in Kitsap County, Washington. Established on less than 4 acres of land next to America's third largest naval base, the center was constructed as a response to the arrival of submarine-launched Trident ballistic missiles and sea-based nuclear weapons in Puget Sound. After moving in 1989 to Birmingham, Alabama, through which trains carrying nuclear weapons passed, they founded a Catholic worker house there for homeless families in 1993. An author and theologian, Jim Douglas, has also published several books, including The Nonviolent Coming of God and the much-discussed JFK and the Unspeakable. In 1997, the Douglases were honored with the prestigious Pacham in Terrace Award. Other recipients of this prize have included Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the Dalai Lama. Jim and Shelley, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Isaac, if you want to ask the first question, you can go
Absolutely. May I call you Jim and Shelley?
Oh, please.
All right. Jim and, I'm a Southern boy, so, I'm used to Mr. and Mrs. Yes, sir, no, sir. So, all right. Jim and Shelley, you all have been committed activists for over 50 years, and that is incredibly impressive on its own. But how did you first become involved with Pax Christi USA?
I don't remember. We've been involved with Pax Christi for so long. I think it was during the initial years of the Trident campaign when we were rather lonely out on the Kitsap Peninsula and organizing demonstrations against the submarine. And there was a very big, still is, I think, a very big and active chapter in Seattle that provided all kinds of support and friendship and, lots of things that we needed to keep going. I think that was my first involvement. And we worked, of course, then with Archbishop Hunthausen, who also had ties to Pax Christi.
And with Tom Gumbleton.
Yeah, and Tom.
And you were with him abroad.
That's one of my favorite stories, is going in Iraq before the first war when there were hostages. I was on a tour there trying to help get hostages released, and it was a very, high tension kind of thing. And we, my little group went into the parking lot outside the hotel in Baghdad where the hostages were being held, and it was dark and there were floodlights on and, guards with rifles and everything. And a bus pulled in, and who should be looking out of the window but Tom Gumbleton. So we agreed that we needed to meet in more relaxed circumstances sometime. That's our Tom Gumbleton story.
Gotcha.
Jim, you began a correspondence with Thomas Merton in 1961 while studying at the University of Notre Dame. Can you tell us how this started and what impact it had on your peace work?
Would there have been what would there have been without that? That's a sort of a basic question. I read in the Catholic Worker Thomas Merton's remarkable chant, which was a chant about a commandant at Auschwitz, and it ended up by saying that, oh, you think this is so awful? What about we who do, in effect, the same thing with our missiles and bombs as he was doing? And whoa, I'd never seen Thomas Merton write anything like that before. And he may have, I hadn't seen it. That was really his first breaking into that Holocaust of nuclear war. Wrote him immediately. He wrote back immediately. That was in itself sort of And then our correspondence began and continued for a number of years. And then when I taught at Bellarmine College in Birmingham after coming back from Rome, Italy, excuse me, where did you say, what did I say?
Birmingham.
Oh, Birmingham, that's where we are now. Excuse me. Anyhow, it just kept deepening, and I was able to visit with him from Louisville. So I didn't really know Merton as well then as I have since he died, because not simply from talking to him, he doesn't talk back a whole lot, but by reading more deeply than I could have understood in those days, his writings. So, but just remembering, oh, that's what he meant, you know, in some sort of quick remarks he would make or something that I recall now. And so the unspeakable, which he writes about so profoundly in Raids on the Unspeakable, that's the huge influence on me right now. The unspeakable. Everything is so unspeakable when it gets to the depths of evil.
Awesome. Could you guys provide a little bit of background on what spurred the foundation of the Ground Zero Center? This is my first time ever hearing of it, so I do apologize, but I'm sure there's others out there that probably have never heard of it as well. But what spurred the foundation of the center, the Ground Zero Center?
Well, first of all, it's still there and very active, so you can check out the website to see what they're doing now. It's a great group. At the time, this was in the early 70s, we had been involved in a plowshares type action in Hawaii at the Air Force Base there, Hickam Air Force Base, where the young men who were in the Air Force had come to our group, which was called Small C Catholic Action of Hawaii, and told us that they were targeting schools and hospitals, and could we do something about it? And so we had a 40-day Lenten campaign, and there was an act of civil disobedience during that campaign when Jim Albertini, who is also a teacher of peace, poured blood on files in the Hickam Air Force Base, which turned out to be files with records of anti-personnel weapons being used in Vietnam. So there was a big trial, and Bob Aldridge came to that trial. Bob Aldridge was the designer of the Trident missile and told us about the Trident missile. And then a year later came to visit us and told us that it was going to be home ported about a couple 100 miles from where we were living. So we were burned out peace activists, and we were we were faced with nuclear holocaust, you know, it's right in your backyard. So we decided that the only way we could deal with that would be to build a community that was nonviolent in both personal living and also in political action. And so we formed a group called Pacific Life Community, and always remembering that the founder of the campaign against the Trident was Bob, who designed the reentry vehicle. So there were no enemies in that campaign. We were all potential members, if not actual. So we began to do demonstrations in Kitsap County, Washington, which is across Puget Sound from Seattle and is very heavily militarized. And we realized over time that, that this is still in the days of the USSR, that we didn't feel enmity toward the USSR, but we were beginning to feel enmity toward the Navy people. And they certainly felt that toward us. They felt very attacked and very hostile. So we thought, well, the only way that you can learn to love a person is to get to know them. So we had to learn how to get to know the people in Kitsap County. And to do that, it wasn't enough to come for a day or two, once or twice a year and demonstrate. We had to be there. And so we're Catholic workers. We begged for money and bought this 3.8 acres, which shares common fence with the base, which made them very nervous because we usually did civil disobedience by climbing the fence. And now we own some of the fence. But Jim and I and our son Tom moved down to Kitsap County to just be people and live there and, you know, get to know folks. And Tom was in first grade when we moved. He had a very supportive school environment. He grew up there. He graduated from high school there. We got to know people. Some people joined us, and we had a little community. And we tried to do both confrontation, which would be demonstrations. We did a few, what would you call them? Intrusive actions, where actually some people went into the nuclear weapons storage area to pray. We did trespass actions. We leafleted the base. And we also were just people. You know, our son was on a soccer team, and we ran into people and the two things together over time have really disarmed the community. But the basis was our commitment that as Christians, we had to love our enemy. And the only way to love the enemy is to get to know them. So you have to kind of put yourself into a vulnerable position, which we did by moving there. And then you just see what happens.
A lot of things happened. A lot of things happened. Unimaginable. Unimaginable.
One of the best stories is that you're probably familiar with Nipponzan Myohoji Buddhist order. The Buddhist monks from Japan who chant for peace, you see them almost everywhere when there's a demonstration. They literally walk around the world. They're very much like Franciscans. They own nothing, and they build peace pagodas in the most terrible sites of violence. And they came to Ground Zero early on when we were spending a lot of time in jail. They had this little funky old house, and there was a lot of hostility to us in the neighborhood. And Guruji, who founded it, came to Ground Zero and was there on the night Ronald Reagan was elected president. So for us, that was a hopeful night, even though it was depressing for most people. But he said that the first peace pagoda in the US should be built at Ground Zero to recognize the violence in the missiles and the sacrifice of the people who were going to jail. And the county, of course, was very opposed. It was Japanese, which was still very suspect after the Second World War. There was a lot of hostility. We had a geodesic dome that was burned down. The county granted a building permit and then withdrew it. And it was just a long struggle. And we finally said, okay, it's not the time for a peace pagoda. But last year, was it last year? The
2 or 3 years ago,
county decided that, yes, they wanted a peace pagoda. So now there is a peace pagoda being built with county help.
Yeah.
Help and approval.
What is this?
Who knew?
But that was a 40 years process.
It's a long process.
40-year process.
Jim and Shelley.
And
Oh, sorry.
relationship after relationship.
What was that, Ryan?
I'm wondering if you could tell, this is a story I heard you tell a little while ago that I think is really excellent, about a man named Daryl Thompson.
That's a great story.
You tell.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Daryl, we met Daryl when he was an officer on the Trident submarine going out to sea. At the time, this was fairly early in the lifetime of Ground Zero, and we were going anywhere we could to talk about nuclear weapons and our opposition. And I was invited to a religious ed class at the Catholic Church in Paulsbo that was taught by a friend of ours. And Daryl was invited to the same class. And I gave, my usual talk about nuclear weapons and what they could do and how, it's our duty to resist them. And Daryl came and talked about how, as a Navy officer, he believed in what he did. And it turned out that Daryl held one of the keys that opened the safe that had the wherewithal within it for firing the missiles. So he had a very responsible position, but he was also a Eucharistic minister. And in that same safe was where they kept the Eucharist. The consecrated hosts on a voyage were kept in the same safe with the key that fired the missiles. And somebody in that class asked him if he had to, would he fire the missiles? And he said that he thought for a long time, and he said, yes, he would. But he thought afterward he would go crazy. And then we heard nothing more from Daryl for probably a year or two. And then we heard, or he called to say that he had resigned his job. And the thing that had brought him to that point was the juxtaposition of the Blessed Sacrament and the key to fire the missiles. And that it just, he couldn't deal with that anymore. He had to give up one or the other. And he chose to keep his tie to the sacrament and leave his job at the Navy.
There are so many stories of that type, simply by the sense of family that went over and transcended the fence, the family situation. And Archbishop Hunhausen, our Catholic Archbishop, became involved in that process. He made a speech where he called Trident the Auschwitz of Puget Sound. And he did so as a very pastoral person. How do you do both prophecy and that in the same? That was Archbishop Hunhausen. He put those things together. Of course, that's what Jesus did. And one day we were leafleting in front of the base, as we did every week. We would pass out 2,000 leaflets a week. And a man stopped where I was leafleting and took the leaflet and he said, "I'd like to have dinner with you." Oh, so I wrote very quickly on my little notepad, and he came to dinner. And when he walked into our house, he sat down and he said, his first sentence, he said, "I want you to explain to me," he said this to Shelley and me, "what it means to be the chaplain." He was the Catholic chaplain of the base. "What it means to be the chaplain of the Auschwitz of Puget Sound." And he resigned his job eventually and became a part of our Ground Zero community. But I mean, these are inconceivable kinds of transitions for people in those positions. And just for them to share that with us, the way Bob Aldridge did, who started the whole process, the whole Trident campaign, the whole campaign to stop the weapon, began in Lockheed Missiles and Space Corporation, in the heart of the man who designed the weapon. Circle, 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 circle.
Your stories are so rich and, talk so much about the work that it took to build those relationships and some of the outcomes. So what specific joys and challenges stick out for you after all these years, decades of peace work?
There was one kind of funny but joyful thing when our son Tom, who, as I said, went through first grade through high school graduation in Kitsap County, there was a baccalaureate. There's always a baccalaureate when kids graduate, and we went to the baccalaureate with a couple of the Buddhist monks in their orange robes. So we were there, and I think everybody else was a Navy person, mainly in uniform. And of course, in that county, if you weren't in the Navy, you still depend on the Navy because that's the economic system. So we're all in this big auditorium, and I think there were about 300 people in Tom's class, and they voted on a class song. And nobody knew what the class song was because they would come to the baccalaureate, and I think it was the end of the baccalaureate, they stood up and they sang this song to their parents. So you imagine this almost entirely Navy auditorium, and these young adults, actually not kids, in front of them on the stage. And when it came time for their class song, they sang to their parents John Lennon's Imagine. And it was pretty amazing. We knew a lot of those young people, and they had some of them were allowed to come and play at our house, but not at Ground Zero. Some could play at Ground Zero. Tom had to go to their house. It was very nuanced kind of thing. But in the process, they had, not only because of us, they lived in the world. It wasn't just us and them, but they had decided that peace was the way, and that this nuclear stuff was not a good thing. And that was pretty amazing kind of thing. What would you say?
It was a hard thing leaving there to come to Birmingham, Alabama, after these kinds of experiences. And but it was sort of the trains that came into the Trident base there started going east to the Trident submarine base at Kings Bay, Georgia. And in the process, a whole campaign developed, because we had by that time moved into that last house alongside the railroad tracks going to the Trident base. So what came in, we saw, and we were able to trace it across the country, and where it came from in Amarillo, Texas, is where they put all the nuclear weapons together. And then they went to the East Coast to the other Trident base. So we felt called to help out on that tracks campaign going to the East, because the trains were going through all the poorest and most racially oppressed and struggling communities. In other words, the most dangerous weapon system, which is also capable of, in its missile motors and in its nuclear weapons, blowing up all along those tracks. So we felt, try to put these things together, and that's why we moved to Birmingham, Alabama. But it was very hard leaving the people there, but we have always maintained that relationship with them. But then, what on earth are we doing in Birmingham, Alabama? Because what happened when we got to Birmingham?
Yeah. Well, we spent 2 years organizing, preparing for the nuclear train to come, and we had very good community support. We worked a lot with the surviving civil rights leaders from back in the old days, who are no longer with us, but they, it was an obvious connection, these engines of destruction sitting in inner city Birmingham. But after 2 years, there still hadn't been a nuclear weapon shipped through Birmingham. And eventually we found out through Freedom of Information Act that before we even moved to Birmingham, the DOE had decided there was so much protest that they wouldn't ship the weapons on trains anymore. So we came and were preparing for, something that wasn't going to happen. The missile motors still came through. So we were kind of, all right, now what do? We moved all the way across the country, and here we are in Birmingham. And do we go back to ground zero? Do we stay here? What do we do? And we decided that ground zero was well underway without us after 2 years, and they didn't need us to come back. And I had always wanted to open a Catholic worker house. So we thought, well, maybe this was sort of a nudge from the Holy Spirit that, okay, get with it, do what you want to do. So that's what we did. We opened Mary's house. It wasn't quite as easy as it sounds when I say it that way, but we did, again, beg money and bought a house and spent a year with help rehabbing it and opened it as a shelter for families primarily. And that was in '93, so it's pushing 30 years old.
I'm just so struck how, just you telling this story, how you touched on all of the pillars of things in Pax Christi, and you've shown how all these issues get woven together. Because a lot of these things, I think a lot of times people think of them all as in a vacuum. And just listening to you tell these stories, you touch on each and every one of them together. So, yeah. So, Brian, if you want to ask the next question.
Sure, and to Isaac's point, it's interesting that you connect the transportation of nuclear weapons with racism taking place in those small towns. And ironically, the Department of Energy had nicknamed these trains white trains because of the color of the trains. And then they started painting them different colors because they didn't want people to protest them. That's an interesting part of what was going on.
Interesting.
Everything comes together.
Yep.
But they left the roofs white because the Soviets had to be able to see them.
Right.
They were only trying to hide them from us.
And just as a reminder, Pax Christi's 50th anniversary conference will take place August 5th through the 7th in Washington, D.C. Jim and Shelley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.